Is that Prince Rakeem? What's today's mathematics?
Truth is universal. Truth cannot be invented.
Then it was guaranteed that Marcus Garvey would come the next night. And the hall was packed with people. And everybody went with ammunition.
How they understand themselves as African, right, and American. Like, it's not either or, right?
Everybody who knows anything about Israel knows that in order to effectuate significant change, you not only need a majority, you need a Jewish majority.
America awards her killers, and they get ribbons and stripes and bars.
A U.S. State Department sponsored program and set of musical tours called the Jazz Ambassadors.
Talks about the work of Marcus Garvey and the work of the Honorable Elijah Muhammad as being demonstrative of, and he basically called them total nationalists.
But the reality is that African people are not vicious, violent people.
He's not teaching hate, he's teaching history.
Peace, peace, peace. Welcome to another episode of Wise the Dome TV. Today I have my friend, brother, and comrade, Dwayne Omowale here. It's always a pleasure to have him on. Brother Dwayne, thank you for coming through.
Appreciate the invite. It's definitely been a minute.
Yeah, it's been a minute. It's been a minute. This is long overdue. And so we're here for the most part to talk about his latest book, Christ and the Wretched of the Earth. I got through finished reading it last week. Great book as always. What kind of inspired you to write about this and tackle this topic?
Well, I'm sure when you were going through the book, I don't know if you noticed at the beginning, I actually dedicated it to First Antioch Missionary Baptist Church and the pastor of the church, Anthony Ducksworth. And the reason why I did so is that was the inspiration, really, just being a member of that church, listening to some of the things that the pastor said in the sermons. Some conversations that I've had with him as well inspired me to write that book. And really the message that I took away from the things that he's been preaching and the things that he's told me in private conversations is the fact that at its core, Christianity really is supposed to be a religion promoting radical change. It's supposed to be a religion promoting uplifting people, challenging those who are in positions of power if they're abusing those powers to manipulate and exploit people. And as you've seen, through reading the book, obviously, throughout history, that's not how Christianity has been typically used. So the inspiration for that book is really to get back to the root of what Christianity is supposed to be about, getting back to the fundamentals of what Christ was actually teaching, and to dispel some of the mythologies behind it, to really debunk a lot of the ways that Christianity has been used to colonize and enslave our people. And obviously that's a big theme in the book as well, the fact that this is a religion that initially wasn't intended to be a weapon used against African people. It was not intended to be used as a weapon for imperialism, but throughout history that's how it's been utilized, particularly against African people.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, one thing I want to ask you before we kind of get into some of the specifics in the book, we've talked about this off air before, but the idea that Christianity is a white man's religion, right? When actuality, the Levant was not a place that was just overcrowded with Europeans. But what are your thoughts on that idea that Christianity is the religion of the white man?
That's also part of the inspiration behind the book, and something that I do address in the book as well, that because of the way that Christianity has been manipulated, Europeans and European colonialism, they've definitely perfected the art of propaganda and the art of indoctrinating people. So, many of us have a hard time even conceptualizing an image of Jesus that isn't white, because you see that white image of Jesus everywhere. And I know, particularly for me, coming from a Catholic background, being in Catholic school, it took a while for me to take a step back and realize, well, wait a minute, everything happening in the Bible is happening in Asia and North Africa. Mm-hmm. And nothing happening in the Old Testament is happening in Europe. And when Europe does eventually come up in the Bible, it comes up in the context of the Christian religion emerging out of North Africa, out of Asia, or what we call the Middle East, and coming into Europe from the outside. So this is not a white man's religion. It's not a European religion in the sense that it didn't originate there. It came from the outside. And the other aspect of it as well, which I've addressed a little bit in this book and I've addressed in other writings, is that, again, going back to the core and the fundamentals of what Christianity is supposed to be about, it's actually contrary to the type of culture that was practiced in Europe at the time. And in the book, I point out how, prior to the missionaries coming in and, civilizing Africans and Christianity and everything that they claimed that they did, because according to them, our ancestors were backwards and savages. But I point out in the book that many of the values in traditional African societies were actually very similar to the type of values that Christ was promoting in terms of taking care of people, that level of selflessness that was part of our culture. Now contrast that to European culture, particularly European religions, you'll find that was never part of European culture to begin with. And I don't really go too much in detail in this particular book, but something that I've studied and written about is when you actually study pre-Christian European religions, or what we call pagan religions, you'll quickly see that this is not a culture that could have ever produced something like a Christianity when you see what Zeus was doing or what the Norse gods were doing. Because, the funny thing about the Marvel films, I think, because most people, when they think of Thor, they think of the Marvel films and the superhero. So I think people have a very romantic image of who these Norse gods were, but, these are very destructive gods. Fighting wars, battles, Zeus as well. Zeus was actually a very horrific figure. So when you look at the culture of Europe and the religion of Europe, this is not a society that was ever going to produce Christianity. As a matter of fact, one of the things that I point out in that book is that's part of the reason why Europe was so hostile towards Christianity in the first place. That when Christianity began to spread and came into Africa, again, because of the type of culture we have as a people, Christianity was welcomed in Africa to the point where some Christians were actually coming to Ethiopia to escape persecution in Rome, because when Christianity began spreading in Rome, that's how Rome handled it. Rome just decided to suppress that religion. So it's very ironic, the perception that Christianity is the white man's religion, when initially white people really don't want much to do with Christianity.
Yeah, that's deep. That's deep. One thing you also point out, and you kind of alluded to some of it just now, that our concept of God did not originate in Africa with the coming of, European missionaries. From the Akan to the Yoruba, they all challenged that quote unquote civilizing narrative. Can you talk about a little bit more about that, about, pre-colonial African cosmologies and, the idea that we were not a people that did not have a concept of God?
Yeah, and actually, so part of, and this is mentioned in the book, but part of what inspired me to write the book, and I mentioned before about certain conversations, certain things I've heard Reverend Ducksworth of First Antioch mention, something that he actually brought to my attention is when you read the Bible, even the Bible seems to indicate that African people were connected to God before the Hebrews were, and the Hebrews were supposed to be God's chosen people. And the thing that I mentioned in the book, and I specifically credit Reverend Ducksworth with bringing this to my attention, was the fact that when Moses married his wife Zipporah, who was, for those who don't know, the Bible describes her as being a Cushite or Ethiopian. She was African. Her father was a priest, and he was actually instructing Moses in terms of how to lead his people towards God and how to worship God. So what was brought to my attention about it is, when you read the Bible, the Hebrews really don't form that covenant with God and really form that connection to God and become God's chosen people until after they leave Egypt. So before the Hebrews even form that connection with God, here you have an African who's already a priest. He's, according to the Bible, already serving God, already has that connection to God. So that even the Bible shows us that when we look at African history, African people already had that connection to God, already had that concept of a divine creator before not only the Europeans, but even before the Hebrews, actually. So I think it's very important to really point that out, because as you mentioned, and as I show in the book, part of the justification for colonialism was this idea that African people, in addition to being savages and uncivilized and all of that rhetoric, but in addition to all that was the concept of a people without religion. They call us heathens. We didn't have religion. We didn't have a concept of God. So I think it's important to really show that African people had, concepts of God before the missionaries came, and African people understood the idea of us coming from a divine creator, understood the concept of, as you pointed out, a particular type of cosmology. And we typically associate, for example, heaven and hell with something that comes out of Christianity, something that comes out of the Abrahamic religious tradition. But when you look at many African religions, for example, Kemet or ancient Egypt, when you look at their religious philosophies or cosmology, you find a similar type of concept of, as humans, we're not just living in this world for the present. There's also an eternity that awaits us, and the nature of what awaits us in eternity is dictated by how we behave in this world, or your conduct. And that's why I mentioned heaven and hell is based on this concept of, depending on if you're a wicked or a righteous individual, that shapes what happens to you when you die. And we find the same thing in Kemet. The concept of Mayat was a concept of divine balance, divine order. So that, among the Egyptians, the concept was, when you died, you actually had to go face judgment. And the judgment was, what kind of person were you when you were alive? And depending on who you were, you either were given a divine reward, which is eternal life. And for those who are familiar with Christianity and Islam, that's precisely what those religions promote, that those who were righteous are rewarded with eternal life. And in the concept of Mayat, those who were wicked were punished. So after people understood everything that we find in Abrahamic religions, not just Christianity, but Islam as well. These are concepts that existed in Africa before those religions got there. So I think it's important to point that out, because it not only dispels a lot of the justifications for colonialism, but it also really connects us back to who we are as a people. Because I think part of the problem with colonialism is that it really indoctrinates us to think of ourselves through their lens rather than examining who we were before colonialism came. So it's important to understand this history and to give us a sense of culture and a sense of identity before we were colonized.
Absolutely. And speaking of Kemet, yeah, your heart had to be light as a feather, and when we talk about Christianity as we know it today, and we know how it has been used as a tool for our enslavement, colonization, even imperialist efforts in the West now to this day. How would you say that something that can be used for such like destruction, but when we look on the other hand, our ancestors found liberation within those same texts? When we talk about Sam Sharpe, Nat Turner, Harriet Tubman was called Moses. The inspiration that we received and got from the book of Exodus, how can something, and I think it's interesting because Elijah Muhammad, once called the Bible the poison book, but it was in the context of, if you don't understand it, what it's saying, just like all things, it could be a poison or a medicine. But how, would you be able to, just verbalize or distinguish, or, just kind of bring clarity to the idea that you have this Christianity that has been used by white nationalists to justify our enslavement, our colonization, and our genocide. And you also have Christianity and the same Bible that has been used as an inspiration to liberate ourselves from those same destructive entities.
So last year, after I published the book, I actually did a Bible study lesson with First Antioch about the topic of the book. And I started by not necessarily discussing the topic of the book, the topic of Christianity. I started by actually discussing our history and our historical figures. So, think about the fact that Martin Luther King, since he's been assassinated, the popular image of him in society is, I have a dream. You never hear anything else but that I have a dream. Malcolm, I made the point that you never hear anything but Malcolm, period. They never give you snippets or sound bites of anything Malcolm said. And the reason why I made that point is, as a leader, as a historical figure, when you're not around to speak for yourself, you become what anybody else wants you to become. So, for example, with Dr. King becomes the image that the dominant society wants him to become. He's not here to speak for himself. So you have all kinds of people claiming his legacy who would have likely opposed him and what he was doing if he were alive. And the reason why I made that point, it's the same thing with Christianity, that when you read the Bible, Jesus was very clear on his worldview, his philosophy, his approach, his teachings, but Jesus isn't around to speak for himself. So because of that, anybody could come and claim that they're Christians and they're promoting the teachings of Christ and they're upholding the Bible because Christ isn't physically around to say contrary. So I start with that because that really gets into the conflict that you're talking about of when we look at the religion of Christianity, it's the question of what does religion actually mean? What does it actually represent? And that's why in the book I focus so heavy on actually showing the scriptures, showing the teachings, because if you don't understand, and again, going back to the original influence of writing the book, Reverend Ducksworth did something I've heard him say several times in church, that if you don't understand the Bible, people could use the Bible to manipulate you. So for me, that's why it was important in the book to actually show the teachings of Christ, to show what it was about. And then to get to your question, the reason why our ancestors drew so much inspiration from the Bible, and it's somewhat ironic that the slave masters thought by introducing Christianity to enslaved Africans, they were making our ancestors docile, and they were teaching our ancestors to turn the other cheek, because that's in the teachings as well, turn the other cheek. What they were concerned about, and what they didn't want, was enslaved Africans reading the other parts of the Bible, reading the parts of the Bible that doesn't give white people the authority to enslave people. You mentioned Harriet Tubman v. Moses, and one of the things I mentioned in the book is the Exodus was actually censored from what they call the slave Bible. So they're giving our ancestors Bibles that were heavily edited and had parts taken out precisely because they wanted to doctor the teachings. They didn't want our ancestors actually reading the teachings in the full context. And for a lot of our enslaved ancestors who actually read the teachings in the full context, they realized, well, wait a minute, there's nothing in this book that actually gives the divine right to rule to white people. God doesn't sanction that white people have to rule the world and that white people have a divine ability to enslave us. And then they continue reading and they realize, well, wait a minute, the Hebrew Israelites were enslaved in Egypt and God came and sent Moses to rescue them. We're enslaved as well. So, there's no reason why God can't come and send saviors to rescue us. So our ancestors started looking at the Bible, and what they took away was not the aspects of the Bible that the slave masters were using to exploit and manipulate them. What they took away was something empowering. They took away a message of, we have the right to stand up to these people who are enslaving us. We have a right to fight back and to rebel, because throughout the Bible, I think it's something that gets overlooked, but really the Bible is a story of the oppressed against the oppressor.
Right.
Hebrews being enslaved in Egypt and going against the Egyptians. Throughout the history of the Hebrews, they're constantly being conquered and dominated by more powerful empires, where it's the Babylonians, the Persians, the Romans later on in the text. So there's a constant theme of an oppressed people fighting against the oppressor, and we find that particularly in the United States with African American history, so much of that spiritual connection we see in the spirituals and religious teachings was a worldview that connected the African American struggle to what the Hebrews experienced, particularly in Egypt, because African Americans looking at the Bible saw themselves not as the Pharaoh necessarily in the story. They saw themselves as the oppressed people who were crying out for liberation from God, and the people who were ultimately liberated by God. So that's how our ancestors viewed those teachings. But as I pointed out, obviously, slave masters, they wanted to promote a doctored view of Christianity and a doctored version of the Bible that upheld their right to rule.
Right. Absolutely. Absolutely. And when we, one thing that I would like to, it's to kind of just touch on just for a second, I have like this, it kind of goes into, it's called, The Black Man Father Civilization, proven by biblical history, and it kind of goes into like a lot of early AME stuff and Bishop Henry McNeal Turner, and it's so interesting, right? Because within the 5% paradigm, the first question that we were taught to memorize was, who is the original man? And the answer is, the original man is the Asiatic black man, and maker, the owner of the cream of the planet Earth, father, civilization, God of the universe. And what's so interesting is a lot of our Christian brothers were saying the same thing back then. Bishop Henry McNeal Turner absolutely said what God was a Negro, right? And so it's just interesting how a lot of these ideas and concepts are most definitely not new. When we talk about missionaries and their colonial civilizing mission, right? and how Christianity was used to justify colonial conquest. For those who may not be, aware of some of the history of how missionaries were used and as weapons, right, against African people. Can you talk about just some of that history and the manner that, because to be honest with you, Europeans are still sending missionaries to Africa to this day, right? And so can you talk about the political context of that?
Right. So we spoke about it a little bit earlier before, where I mentioned the idea that Europeans promoted this image of Africans being a backwards people and uncivilized people. So that was a justification for going in and trying to, quote unquote, civilize African people. So the problem with the missionary work, and I mentioned this in the book, is that not only were they converting Africans to Christianity, they were converting Africans to a Eurocentric version of Christianity. And something that I touched on in this book and I've mentioned in other writings, that one of the issues with the missionary effort in Africa is that Europeans essentially made Africans believe that to become a Christian was to become a European. You had to completely change your cultural identity. In many cases, you could change your African name. You had to take on a European name. So what they were doing, and this is it's interesting, the psychology behind it, because Christianity and Islam are unique in the sense that they're what we would call a universal religion, meaning that when we look at traditional African religions, these religions tend to be connected specifically to the culture of the people who originated the religion. So, for example, the Yoruba religion is specific to the Yoruba people. When we talk about Kemet, that religion is specific to the culture and the people of Kemet. Christianity, was not meant to be specifically confined to the geographical region or the people amongst which it emerged. And it's the same thing with Islam, that even though, obviously Islam is a religion that comes out of Arabia, when you read the Quran actually instructs Muslims to go out and to spread the faith and to convert others. So we find with Christianity and Islam this viewpoint of actually going out and converting other people to the faith, and that's something that's, like, as I pointed out, unique to those religions. It's not something you find in traditional African cultures. And the reason why I make this point is that if Christianity is a universal religion, then anybody should be able to be Christian regardless of their cultural background. You shouldn't have to change your culture to become a Christian. So that's one of the issues with the missionary effort in Africa, that they were not only promoting Christianity, but they're promoting this idea that to be saved, to truly be a Christian, you have to essentially become culturally European. And the psychology that came with that was Africans who converted to Christianity, and this is not all Africans, as I point out in the book. Some Africans actually used their churches to organize rebellion against colonialism, but for some Africans who converted to Christianity, they viewed colonialism as a benefit, because in their mind, colonialism is what brought them to Christianity, and their view or conception of Christianity was something that was very European. So the missionary effort was actually utilized to really prepare African people to accept being colonized. And obviously, when we think about colonialism, the one aspect of colonialism was the military force that was involved, but the other aspect was the ability to psychologically and spiritually colonize African people. Because if I can colonize your spirit, then I don't even need a military, because you won't fight back or revolt anyways. And unfortunately, many Africans who embraced Christianity were Africans who accept the logic of colonialism, who accepted the worldview that African people were really a backwards, uncivilized heathen people who needed to be Christianized and civilized by outside influences. And Edward Wilmot Blyden, who a lot of people would know him as one of the forerunners of Pan-Africanism. Unfortunately, when you read his writings, he was one of those individuals who accepted the idea that African people were completely uncivilized before Christianity. So his vision for Liberia was for Africans in the diaspora to come back and basically civilize the Africans on the continent. So the reason why I mention him is he would be an example of somebody who, even though his worldview was one that was rooted in African liberation and freedom, it was still very much centered in a colonial outlook and a Eurocentric outlook, because he embraced not only Christianity, but a particular Eurocentric type of Christianity. And then what becomes fascinating with him is when he realized that among European Christians, racism seemed to be so entrenched in how they practice Christianity, that he began to look at Islam as a potential alternative for African people. And it's interesting because he looked to Islam for the same reason that Malcolm was gravitating to Islam, especially when he went to Mecca and saw that it seemed that in the Muslim world, there was less racism than among the European Christians. Now, obviously, we know that there is a long legacy of Arab racism against African people. But I mentioned, Blyden in this context to point out that initially he accepted the Eurocentric worldview of African people needing to be Christianized because we were people who didn't have a culture or religion prior to that. And then the issue that he ran to subsequently was that it was difficult for him to disconnect European racism from European Christianity because his conception of Christianity was completely Eurocentric to begin with.
Right. Right. And you mentioned Islam. And so I wanted to ask you, it's not necessarily in the book, but I think it can definitely fit within the context of this conversation. As Pan-Africans, we have heard a lot, obviously, through our years of, being in community with other Pan-Africans and organizing and being part of different organizations. And so, Abrahamic faiths can have a lot of our, Pan-African brothers and sisters, view them in a negative light. One of the things that they say about Islam, and I wanted your opinion on this, is that all of West Africa got Islam through the sword. But from my research, with brothers like Mustafa Briggs and people that have highlighted the African presence in early Islam, it seems to me that there was an African presence in Islam during the time of the Prophet Muhammad himself, right? Like there's many of his companions were African people. But even with that said, the idea that our people and our ancestors in West Africa only got Islam through the sword, doesn't that in a way take away any type of agency that they may have had in, wanting to adopt Islam as their way of life?
Yeah, and it's the same point with Christianity as well. That typically we tend to think of Christianity as being introduced into Africa solely through European colonialism and slavery. But the reality is that Ethiopia willingly accepted Christianity for much of the same reason that many West African states accepted Islam. And I think part of why Pan-Africanists have this criticism of Abrahamic religions is the idea that these religions are alien to African people. They come out of African culture, and they have a very strong viewpoint of African people adopting any religion, philosophy, worldview, or ideology that comes out of our culture. But my view on that is, again, going back to the point I made earlier, Christianity was not a European religion. It came into Europe, and Europeans were able to take Christianity and to utilize it to advance their interest. A point I also make often is Buddhism. We take it for granted that Buddhism is not a Chinese religion,
Right.
Actually from India and came into China that way. So throughout history, you find that people of a particular culture or civilization can adopt ideas that come from the outside and make it their own. And an example that I can give is, if you go in America, if you go to a white church, you're not going to have the same experience as if you go to a a black church, particularly a southern Baptist.
You already know.
So the reason why I mention that is it's the same Bible, same religion, but African people throughout history have had the ability of being able to take ideas, take religions or things that come from outside of our culture, and to make it our own. The same way all people have done. And like I said, going back to the point of Europeans, that Christianity is not a European religion, but yet the largest Christian denomination in the world is the Roman Catholic Church, and the Vatican is the seat of the Catholic Church. Now, how could the Vatican, located in Europe, be the seat of Catholicism when that religion didn't originate out of Rome, didn't originate out of Europe? Right. So I make the point that, again, other people could take religions and ideas and concepts that come outside of their culture and make it their own. So, for me, African people have the same agency. African people have the same ability to encounter new ideas, to encounter new religions, and decide that if this is something that speaks to you, if this is something that touches you and that you believe can actually transform and change your life, then go ahead and adopt it and use it to your benefit. So I personally have no issue with that. Now, because that's my view, I've definitely received a lot of criticisms from certain people who, and actually in the past I've even been called a fake Pan-Africanist for my views on religion. But again, going back to the inspiration for the book. Like I pointed out, the inspiration for the book is being a member of First Antioch Missionary Baptist Church, and a point I will make about that church is some of the best Pan-African work that I've been able to do has been out of First Antioch in terms of the actual resources that we've been able to send to our people throughout Africa, throughout the Caribbean. So, part of my defense of African people who practice Abrahamic religions is that, and I mean, historically, not even just my experience with First Antioch, historically, the Black church has been a seat of resistance among, particularly in the United States, has been a seat of resistance for Black people here. It's been the center of a lot of our efforts, the center of the effort to fight slavery. Obviously played a huge role in the civil rights movement, and I do mention that in the book as well. So I think when we look at the history of African people, we've definitely been the people who have been able to take these religions and to make it our own and to use it for our benefit. So as you make a great point about how to dismiss African people embracing Abrahamic religions, I think, is to strip us of the agency and the ability to do what other people have done when it comes to new ideas and new religions.
Obviously, when it comes to Pan-Africanism, a lot of our brothers and sisters are, socialist, communist, or, and Karl Marx, obviously once said that religion is the opiate of the people. But when it comes to African people, right, you're not going to get 1.5 billion Africans at home and abroad to suddenly become atheists, right? It's just not who we are as a people. Some may see that as a weakness, but others may, draw their strength from whatever their spiritual beliefs are. And I'm not just talking about Abrahamic faiths, right? Like it could be whatever, Lukumi, Ifa, whatever you're doing, whatever helps you, you know what I mean? But when it comes to organizing, right, like, what do you see could be possible issues whenever people go really, really hard in alienating the segment of our community that are religious?
So I'll start by saying, and this is, I don't think this should be taken as a critique of Karl Marx or Marxism, but Marx wrote about revolution. He wasn't a revolutionary. He never led one. Nat Turner actually led an uprising. Toussaint Louverture actually led a successful revolution.
Nat Turner killed more devils than Karl Marx.
And here's the reason why I make that point, that when you're writing about revolution and theorizing about revolution, you're going to have one viewpoint. When you're actually involved in the process of fighting revolutionary struggle, fighting for change, you're going to take a very different approach. And Kwame Ture made the point about how the Communist Party, obviously being the Communist Party, took the position of being an atheistic political party, denied the existence of God. But he said when they were organizing the South, the only place they could organize was in the church. So in theory, they were atheists, but in practice, they had to organize with the people that they were confronted with, and the people they were confronted with were largely Christians. So I start by making that point that when you're actually engaged in the process of the struggle, it's one thing to have certain theories and certain ideas about religion, but you have to deal with reality. And reality is our people are very deeply religious, whether it's Abrahamic religions like Christianity or Islam, or whether it's traditional African spiritual practices. It's just part of our culture. Now, as I pointed out before, the statement I made, I hope people don't take it as a criticism.
No, I already know.
It's just the reality that he wasn't. But the other thing I will say about Karl Marx, and this is a point that Kwame Ture made, is that in addition to him not being a revolutionary, what he really was just somebody who was writing about his observations of European history and European society. And as I pointed out before, European society was very oppressive when it came to the question of religion. So his view of religion was shaped by how religion was used in Europe. And that's been, and Kwame Ture made this point that religion in Europe is a whole different thing than how African people have viewed and related to religion. And it's not to say that among African people we don't have our problems pertaining to religion. And I even mentioned in the book that African people, whether we're talking about Black churches here in America or some of the churches in Africa, we do have a problem of people using their religions to exploit people, of people using religions for opportunistic purposes. So the point isn't that African people, when it comes to religion, haven't had those type of problems, or that there aren't things to critique about the church. But generally speaking, how African people have related to religion has been different than how Europeans have related to religion. So for us, it's never been an opium that's made us docile and made us not want to struggle. And that's why I gave those examples of Africans who actually led revolutionary struggles who were religious. And I think, as I said, I think Karl Marx's views on religion were just influenced by the reality of how Europe was historically viewed religion.
Right. No, absolutely. One thing that, and speaking of that, just like what we were saying about Karl Marx, and obviously, I personally study Marx. I value his critique on capitalism. But as somebody, and you mentioned, Nat Turner, and a brother in the military once told me, that had been, I saw, he had experienced war firsthand. And, one of the quotes that they used to say was, "There ain't no atheists in the foxhole," right? And I know revolutionaries, members of personally, Black Liberation Army veterans, people that were political prisoners, who found their spiritual beliefs and their religious beliefs to help them get through. You know what I'm saying? And I don't think we can ever discount that and the power of that, regardless to what our own personal beliefs are, right? Like, if that's what powers them in order to continue to fight and helping to liberate our people, then I would never want to take that away from them. You know what I mean? One thing that you mentioned in the book, and I would like for you to kind of talk to the people about, is you mentioned Marcus Garvey was adamant about, when it comes to the story of King David, Queen of Sheba. No, hold on. Was it King Solomon?
Solomon.
King Solomon and Queen of Sheba. King Solomon, Queen of Sheba, Menelik, and the story of the Keeper Nagast. And he's like, "Hey, man, y'all should be more proud of your lineage with the Queen of Sheba than you are of King Solomon's lineage." What do you think explain to the people what the idea about that, what Garvey was trying to convey there?
So what he was trying to convey, and again, it goes back to the critique I mentioned that some Pan-Africanists have of Abrahamic religions as being alien religions coming from an outside culture and an outside people. So what Garvey was pointing out is, and for those who aren't familiar, traditionally the monarchy in Ethiopia, according to tradition, descends from King Solomon, through the Queen of Sheba. The Bible doesn't explicitly mention this, but the Keeper Nagast argues that the Queen of Sheba produced a child by Solomon when she came to visit him. So what Garvey was essentially arguing is that for so many years, the tradition has always upheld Solomon and upheld David, upheld the Israelites' connection in that lineage. And he was making the point that, why are we upholding a non-African lineage when the Queen of Sheba is right there? Shouldn't we be upholding the African part of that lineage? So Garvey was making an argument for what we later call an African-centered or Afrocentric worldview, which is one that centers the history and the cultural experiences of African people. So that when Garvey is looking at this history, he's telling African people that the part that we should be most proud of is not the Hebrew connection. We should be more proud of the African connection.
Indeed. Also, one of the things that has been used to, I guess, justify the idea that we, are savage people or cursed people was the whole curse of Ham story. As you mentioned, it talks about this in Genesis 9. And also contextually, it was also weaponized to legitimize slavery. But at the same time, you mentioned it was countered by people like Martin Delaney arguing that Ham founded ancient Egypt or ancient Kemet.
Yeah.
For people that don't know, can you tell them like what the curse of Ham is and why that was used, and how, I guess, how it was used or how it was weaponized to legitimize slavery?
So in the original story in Genesis, the curse actually was Noah had cursed Ham's son Canaan to be enslaved. Now historically, that got twisted to Noah was cursing Ham and all of his descendants, and as I point out in the book, it further became twisted as part of the curses. They became black, but as I point out in the book, when you read the original story, it's not a curse upon all of Ham's descendants. It's only a curse upon his son Canaan. But also, the text doesn't mention anything about skin color. Doesn't mention anything about people becoming black or becoming perpetual. It doesn't mention an entire race of people becoming perpetually enslaved. So again, it goes back to the point.
Not even in the Bible, is what you're saying.
Yeah, it's not in the Bible, but so it goes back to the point I was saying that if you don't actually read or understand what's in the Bible, you could very easily be manipulated by people telling you things that seem plausible but really aren't actually in the Bible. So in this case, it's a curse that the concept of this particular curse is really a perversion of the actual story that's in the biblical text. But as you pointed out, it was used to justify the enslavement of African people when it wasn't really. And the original concept in the Bible was not supposed to be a justification of African people. It wasn't even meant to insinuate that blackness or our physical appearance was a curse that was brought upon Ham. But and as you pointed out in the book, I also made reference to Martin Delaney, and basically what he was trying to do is to look at this history. And again, what Garvey was doing, create an African-centered perspective. So he's looking at this history and saying, well, if our slave masters are telling us that Ham is somebody that we're supposed to be ashamed of because Ham is the progenitor of all black people, then instead of being ashamed of Ham, instead of viewing Ham as this cursed figure, I'm going to honor him as the progenitor of all black people. I'm going to honor him as the father of ancient Kemet and father of ancient African civilization. So he was taking what the slave masters were telling us was supposed to be a negative aspect of the Bible and actually using it as something that was empowering for our people.
Absolutely. Another thing that we definitely have to talk about, because this has angered me ever since he said it, but good old white nationalist Pat Robertson and his idea that Haiti suffers and Haiti has gone through, the poverty and that it has gone through because Haiti made a pact with the devil. And I remember seeing that for the first time whenever he said it. And I just remember being so angered by that, right? Because obviously we know the efforts of France and the West and the United States and how they have, destabilized Haiti. Because two, obviously, we can use Haiti for cheap labor, but also what I would say is the threat of a good example, meaning that Haiti can never be prosperous because Haiti is a nation. Haiti would be proof of what can happen whenever you get rid of your former slave masters or current slave masters, I should say. But can you talk about the whole Pat Robertson, the Pat Robertson thing, and also add in the context of also Boukman during the Haitian Revolution and how he framed the conflict and how he urged the other Haitians to find your black God, find your culture, find your find remove yourself of what this colonizer has given you. So can you talk about that some?
Yeah, so that statement, there's two reasons why I mentioned the Pat Robertson statement in the book. The first one is to, going back to the topic we discussed before, to further reinforce the point I was making about how our people were not a savage, backwards people before colonialism. So he was trying to frame what Haiti did as making a pact with the devil, presumably because he views traditional African religions, particularly voodoo in Haiti, as being demonic, as being satanic, as being devil worship. So the reason why I mentioned that in the book is to actually show how the Haitians themselves viewed their religion. And I quote book one, who, for him, he wasn't making a pact with the devil. He was specifically calling upon God. He was calling upon the God of Black people, and he actually makes the distinction between what he saw as the Black God and the God of white people. And one of the things I mentioned that I think is very important to understand about Bookman and how he viewed his connection with God is he viewed the Black man's God as the God that was calling Black people to do righteous things. He viewed God as a righteous God, contrasting that with the white man's God, who he felt was compelling white people to do evil and wicked things. So it's that contrast of, if we were to accept the logic of Pat Robertson and many missionaries who view African religions as being evil, then the good guys in a story would be the Christian slave masters who were torturing and enslaving and brutalizing African people. So it's that contrast of, when we look at history, who's really the devil in that story? The man who's calling upon a God who he believes is a righteous God, who's compelling his people to do righteous deeds, or the people who are worshiping a God who's justifying their abuse of another people? And you mentioned Elijah Muhammad. Obviously, for theological reasons, a lot of Christians would disagree with the idea that the white man is the devil. But I make the point that what was important about that teaching was Elijah Muhammad actually identified the devil as something real, as something that actually impacts your life. Too often, Christians think of the devil as this big, scary red man with some horns and a tail and a fork. And I make the point of, you never see that man. You never in your life have you ever seen a big, scary, because here's the thing, if you were to see someone looking like that, you would know, hey, that's the devil. Right. But the point of Elijah Muhammad's teachings was the devil isn't some imaginary mythological figure. The devil is real. The devil actually operates in your day-to-day life. And John Henry Clark made the point of, whoever is in charge of your hell is your devil. I think it's important to recognize that the devil is not as big, because even in the Bible, again, going back to understand the Bible, in the Bible, the devil never appears as a big scary red man. He always appears as something that's familiar. Going back to Genesis, the Garden of Eden, if you're living in a garden, a serpent doesn't seem that unusual to you. If you're living in a garden and you've never seen a big demonic figure, you might not want to listen to that man. But I'm familiar with serpents. I live in a garden, so I make that point to show that, as I said, part of why I wanted to mention that situation is to show that, contrary to Pat Robertson's view and the worldview of many Eurocentric Christians, traditional African religions shouldn't be viewed as being demonic or satanic. Which should be viewed as demonic and satanic are Christians who actually abuse that religion to exploit and oppress other people, which then gets me to the second point of the other problem with people such as Pat Robinson. And, this even goes back to the point you made before about the difference between how African people have traditionally practiced Christianity and Europeans. It's that in the West, Christianity generally has been used as a religion to instill people with a sense of self-righteousness to where they could look down upon other people, particularly people of another religion. So the worldview is, if I accept Christ as my Lord and Savior and I'm saved, then I am morally superior to people who don't practice my religion.
Yeah, absolutely. And
go ahead.
No, I was going to say what you remind me of. There was a professor. He was born early 1900s, John Lavelle, and he was been a professor at Howard for 45 years. But he used to write a lot about the music of the African diaspora, the literature, the folklore. And I was reading some work on the folklore that he was documenting. And it's so very interesting because, this idea of black man is God, white man is devil that we were just talking about. But on the plantation, the very interesting thing that he was talking about, right? And what he documented were things that the idea of Moses or the idea of Christ was any liberating figure in the lives of the enslaved African. The idea of hell would be either the plantation or North America itself. The idea of devil would be what you just mentioned that John Henry Clark suggested, that the person that is responsible for the current hell that I'm going through. And it's so interesting whenever, like, just reading that work, how regardless to what extent we believed in the Bible or in Christianity as a religion, we were able to even symbolically use the Christian symbolism of Christ, liberator, devil, all of these things, and incorporate that into our worldview at the time, and see it through that lens. Meaning, like being able to see a liberator who comes to liberate self from slavery would be the reason why Harriet Tubman would be called a Moses, right? Like, you know what I'm saying? And so these things aren't new. And I just find it fascinating how our people, regardless to what you give us, as Elijah Muhammad once said, we would settle on the best part of it, use that to our own benefit. You know what I mean? And if you don't have that paper, I'll definitely send that to you. One thing that we talked that I always, you can't not think about this when thinking about the history of the Black church. But 16th Street Baptist Church, recently the Dylan Roof thing. Why do you think white nationalists who are quote unquote Christian, right? Why do you think that for a while attacking, burning, bombing, firebombing Black churches was a part of the tactics they use to terrorize us?
All right, so before I get to that question, I just want to follow up on the conversation about who's the devil, and you sparked something when you said these concepts weren't new. And again, going back to Elijah Muhammad, I think a lot of people associate the teachings of the white man's devil with Elijah Muhammad. It didn't start with him. When you read the writings of Martin Delaney and David Walker, who are Christians, they compare white people to devils in their writings. And actually, I don't know how familiar you are with calypso music out of the Caribbean, but the earliest known calypsonian Grosjean from Trinidad, he actually used to sing that his slave master was the devil. So enslaved Africans already had this concept of, and again, it goes back to why I quoted John Henry Clark. They already had the concept of the devil isn't this big mysterious figure. The devil is the oppression that you deal with on a regular basis. The devil is the wickedness that you deal with on a regular basis. So that concept can start with Elijah Muhammad, and I'm giving the Christian background of enslaved Africans in the New World. But in the book, I don't know if you recall, I even mentioned in the book that Muslim Africans in Sudan came to view the European colonizers as the Antichrist, and they believed that Jesus was going to come back and liberate them from the Antichrist. So long before Elijah Muhammad, you already had African Christians and Muslims who had this concept of the people oppressing them are the Antichrist, the people who are oppressing them are devils. So as you said, these concepts and ideas aren't new. But to get to your question, I think part of why, and it's not just in the United States, I mentioned it a little bit in the book, and I've mentioned it in other books as well, that even in Africa, there was an effort to suppress independent African churches on the parts of the colonial authority. And I think part of why Black churches have been targeted by white nationalists is, as I pointed out before, the recognition that the church is a source of resistance, a source of rebellion on the part of African people, particularly during slavery when Nat Turner led his uprising. The backlash against it was to pass all kinds of laws restricting the ability of African people to read, restricting the ability of African people in the United States to even organize independently. So it became illegal to have an all-Black church worship service. There had to be some white person present. So part of it was the understanding that these people are using these churches to organize and fight back against us. The other part of it is not just the church as a source of rebellion against racism, but the church as a very meaningful aspect of the social life of Black people. And again, to quote John Henry Clark, he said, among Black people, church wasn't just a Sunday religion. Church was a part of every aspect of our life. And there's a book, it's Black History Month, so it's fitting I mentioned this book by Carter G. Woodson talking about the history of the Negro church. And he mentions that the Negro or the Black church wasn't just a religious institution, it was a social institution for everything. People went to the church for everything, because when you think about the conditions of Black people under slavery, we had very few independent institutions. So the church became one of the few institutions that we truly developed and controlled as a people. So part of targeting the churches was an act of suppressing the ability of African people to resist and to rebel. The other aspect of attacking the churches is attacking an institution that's at the very heart of social life among Black people in America, attacking an institution that's very meaningful towards the people. Because if you really want to terrorize the people, you terrorize them in a social setting that's the most meaningful to them. So that's why, you know, particularly white nationalist terrorists would actually target Black churches, because they know that's where you could really, you know, terrorize the people, terrorize them where they feel the safest, terrorize them where they go for refuge, where they go to escape from the oppression, where they go to escape from the devil, to escape from hell. If hell could follow you into your place of sanctuary and refuge, then you're really not safe. So part of it is a psychological tactic as well.
Wow. Yeah, absolutely. You know, one thing and that always has, you know, fascinated me about the Black church, especially in the South. And, you know, once you have a certain understanding, you can see. But the Africanisms that are in the Black church, from, you know, how we do burial services at the church, from
call and response.
Call and response. You know, Mother's Day women wearing all white, or you know, there were even instances like especially in Kojic churches, where they would have like mojo bags, gree bags, right? But for people who would deny that there are any Africanisms in the Black church, especially in the South, like, how would you respond to that? Because the reason I ask is, obviously we are in a period where we have these nativist groups that deny African Americans having any African retentions.
Well, I would also ask them, when we talk about the AME Church, what does the A stand for?
Right.
So, but it's not even just that church. The Abyssinia Baptist Church as well, you know, came out of New York with Adam Clayton Powell. So, you know, as I pointed out, because the church has been one of the few institutions that Black people in the United States have been able to control, part of that is it's been an institution that has actually allowed for a level of African cultural survivals that's been very difficult to do outside of a context of institutions that Black people don't control. And, you know, Asada Shakur, in her autobiography, she mentions the experience of going from a Southern Black church to a Catholic church and how different it is. And that stood out to me because I had the opposite experience. I had the experience of going from a Catholic church to going to a Southern Baptist Black church. But why I mention that is because, I mean, you see those differences. For example, in a Black church, as I point out, is call and response. If the preacher says something that resonates with your spirit, you speak on the spot. In a Catholic church, it's very structured. You only speak when the priest prompts you to respond. And it's funny to me because you know, my family's Catholic, so I still go to you know, Catholic mass every so often. And a few years ago, I was at, you know, Catholic mass, and there was somebody that was shouting amen after everything the priest was saying. And I looked at my mom, who was there with me, and I said, you know, I know that person isn't Catholic. They probably that's not Catholic. So, and that's why I made the point before about how, you know, when you go to these white churches, it's a different experience than going to a Black church. And part of that is because it's not just the religion of Christianity, it's the cultural spirit that you bring into the religion as well. And you know, my writings, that's why in that book I quote Eric Fromm quite often, because he had a very interesting perspective on religion in Europe. His argument was Europeans embraced Christianity from a superficial standpoint, but culturally they remain rooted in the traditional European paganism. So that basically they just still worship Zeus, Hercules, Odin, you know, those Germanic Greco-Roman gods. They just plaster Jesus over the image, but it's the same thing. So again, it goes back to your question of why are these, you know, Christian nationalists terrorizing Black churches, terrorizing Black people? Is because they're still worshiping a religion, still practicing a religion that teaches them that God is a God of war and conquest, because, you know, that's what the Greco-Roman and the Germanic gods were, gods of conquest and destruction. Again, to quote John Henry Clark, he said Europeans worship a God that bred fire. So and I make that point because, you know, again, it goes back to what you're saying about how when you go into a Black church, it's not, and I made the point before that even though Christianity is not a religion that necessarily originated out of Africa, when our people embraced Christianity, they made it their own. So when you go into a Black church, it's very African culturally in a way that a European church isn't, because Europeans, when they embraced Christianity, they also still kept the core of their culture, and the core of their culture is something that's very antithetical to the teachings of Christianity, and that's why we have these particular conflicts. To bring it to more contemporary politics, this is why we have an administration that seems to be trying to wage war all over the world, at the same time professing that's defending Christianity.
Yeah, and they, you know, in colonial times, they did the same thing with Islam in West Africa. Many of the Arabs would see the way we practice Islam and was like, nah, they're not real Muslims. But it's because African people, we're going to practice the thing the way we practice it. You know what I'm saying? You're not going to take that out of us. And we can see that within the Black church. We can see that in the manifestations of early Islam in America, where there's a Nation of Islam, a Moorish Science Temple. We did it the way we did it. And that's just what it is. Unapologetic.
Amos also made the point that people would criticize Elijah Muhammad for teaching Black Islam. And he said, well, that's the point. Black Islam is supposed to be Black for Black people. Black church is supposed to be Black for Black people.
Right. Absolutely. Absolutely. Man, you know, Christ and the Wretched of the Earth, the link is in the description, everybody. Make sure you go out and check it out. Always, you know, support our brother, Dwayne Omowale. He does amazing work, not just academic work, but he's also out there in the field, making sure, you know, our people are taken care of, man. And so we thank him and we appreciate him for all the work that he does. Brother Dwayne Omowale, man, you have a good one. And again, thank you for coming through.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
Absolutely.